I love beer. It's become a normal part of my life. I drink it quite regularly, but it's not the only adult beverage I partake in or even make for myself. In fact, for the last few years, I almost always have a crisp, easy drinking, thirst-quenching, and often quite buzz-inducing keg of hard cider on tap. You're listening to the Brülosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and on this show, contributor Matt Del Fiacco is with me to talk about this delicious alternative to beer.
And this is one of my favorite things to talk about because we typically don't talk about hard cider too often, or not in the same capacity that we talk about beer. We talk about beer like pretty technically. We get really into the commercial production of, and everyone's posting pictures of their brewery tours and all those awesome things. But cider is just as rich and just as there's just as many varieties, and there's so much that goes into it. So it's super fascinating to talk about, and it is one of my favorite drinks.
Yeah. I love hard cider. In fact, I didn't even know how much I loved hard cider until I started making it for myself. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in the modern kind of craft beer world, cider gets sort of a bad rap. You've got things like Ace and Angry Orchard out there who are producing these, just in my opinion, these overly sweet, kind of quirky, kind of gross versions of hard cider. And sure, some people like them and that's all good. But in my experience, hard cider has a couple, or at least the hard cider that I enjoy tends to have a couple very particular characteristics about them. I'll be honest with you. My inspiration for this episode came from the numerous emails I got after mentioning the fact that I use Belle Saison to ferment my hard cider in a recent show on dry yeast, just released a couple weeks ago. I hadn't really considered doing an entire show on cider. But I'm really stoked for this one, and even more excited to have you with me, Matt, seeing as you took gold this year in the National Homebrew Competition for your hard cider.
Yeah, I did. I got a gold this year for my New World Traditional, which is kind of what we would, it'd be a more a modern approach to cider. It'd be but yeah, like it was, I am still kind of blown away by it. I'm still, it really hasn't worn off, but I feel really lucky. And that was actually, we'll talk about it a little bit further in the episode, but that was actually a naturally fermented hard cider. And so I feel even luckier because that's such a gamble. It's such a crapshoot in terms of natural fermentation. So yeah, I'm pumped to talk about this. And there's, like you mentioned, there's a ton of hard ciders out there on the market that are really popular right now, like Cider Boys or Woodchuck or Angry Orchard or Reds. Reds is a classic. But there's a lot of other variety if you wanted to get exposed to other commercial cider makers who are making different kinds of products, maybe not better or worse, but definitely different kinds. And things like Uncle John's or Two Town Cider is something we get here in the Midwest, or Two Fools is one that's, kind of in my area. So there's a fantastic range of cider. There's something out there for everyone. Like I say that about beer. Like if everyone's like, oh, I don't like beer, it's like, well, I don't think you found the right beer yet. Yeah. I feel the same way about cider. There's a cider out there for everyone.
Yeah, there's definitely cider out there for me. But anyways, congratulations. I like how you pulled away from talking about you and your awesome win. Yeah. Congratulations, Matt.
I was hoping that wasn't as obvious as it was. But yeah, no, thank you. It is much appreciated, and it's super great. I'm super excited about it.
It was so fun watching your name come up on that, and to see the Brew Club, which anybody out there can join. If you want to join it, you can head over to thebrewclub.com and check that out. But yeah, man, congratulations. That was super exciting. Hey, before we get into the show, I want to let everybody know about some stuff we've got going on. Brian, Malcolm, and I are going to be heading up to Yakima for Hop Harvest, as well as to attend a couple rad events at the end of the month. We're going to be hanging out with our friends from Yakima Valley Hops at their Fresh Hop Party, which they're hosting on the night of Friday, September 28th. They've got 4 bands lined up to play, a ton of fresh hop beer pouring. I mean, we're talking beer made with literally fresh hops right off of the yard. It's going to be so badass. If you're anywhere near Yakima at this time, you don't want to miss this event. The next night, on Saturday, September 29th, we're going to be hanging out at the annual Fresh Hop Ale Festival, which has been rated one of the top 10 beer festivals in the world. I mean, that's so cool that that's happening in Yakima. Get your tickets for both of these events right now online. Just Google it, Fresh Hop Party and Fresh Hop Ale Festival. We're also going to be collaborating with Wandering Hop Brewing, as well as recording some stuff for all of you people to listen to when we're back in town. Also, don't forget to get your tickets for the Brew Your Own Boot Camp happening in Asheville, North Carolina in March of 2019. 2019. Denny Kahn and I are going to be leading a couple seminars on experimentation and brewing. I'm sure it's going to be every bit as nerdy as this show that you're listening to right now. Tickets go fast. Again, go secure yours right now. If you live anywhere near any of us and you'd like to participate in our experimental antics, we'd love to get you involved. We've got contributors in Anchorage, Alaska, Chicago, Illinois, Denver, Colorado, Pueblo, Colorado, Atlanta, Georgia, Corona, California, and right here in Fresno, California. Just shoot me an email, marshall@brülosophy.com, and I will connect you with the contributor who lives nearest you. If you're looking for an easy way to help us out, you can head over to brülosophy.com/support, where you'll find a list of links to use when you shop online. Thanks so much to everybody who's been doing this. It's a huge help. We also offer rewards for your support. By becoming a patron of Brülosophy, you'll receive things like unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, a chance to win a $50 Love to Brew gift certificate. They pull a new winner every month, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A with a special guest, among other things. Coming up next is Malt Aficionado. Seth Klon from Mecca Great Estate Malt, a rad dude who not only knows grains well, but is an experienced brewer too. The list of upcoming guests includes Russian River's Vinny Chilurzo and Dr. Charlie Bamforth from the UC Davis Brewing Program. All of that just for helping us out a little bit. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/brülosophy. Feedback this week is brought to you by our friends from Imperial Yeast, who provide brewers with the finest quality yeast on the market. Packing 200 billion cells into each pitch-right pouch, brewers are ensured a quick and healthy fermentation. With a wide range of ale and lager strains, as well as some funkier stuff, Imperial Yeast is sure to have what you need to turn your wort into delicious beer or hard cider. Go check out everything Imperial Yeast has to offer at imperialyeast.com today. Listener Andy Bray had a comment in regards to a response we gave in a recent episode from another person who wrote in with feedback. He says Steve Baker's feedback from episode 45 on base malts about the Maillard reaction was really interesting and got me thinking. I'm a geochemist who works on organic carbon stabilization in soils and marine sediments, and the leading view is that this occurs by forming melanoidins through the Maillard reaction. This is usually very slow, pH and temperature dependent. In our recent experiments, compared to ultra pure water, which I have to believe is close to maybe RO water, small concentrations of manganese and iron, less than 50 ppm, he says, in the water catalyze the reaction. We also think that calcium and magnesium could do the same, but we've yet to test that out. That seems really interesting to me and very, very sciencey. Matt, do you have anything to say about that?
I mean, I would agree that it definitely seems sciencey. I'm still trying to figure out what how that's being utilized in like the in soil and water analysis. And that's I'd actually, if you want to follow up on your email, please do, because I'd be super interested to know how that all works. But that's really interesting. And I mean, I know the production of the Maillard reaction in the boil and in wort is super, it's maybe not super debated, but it feels like it's debated. Like there's always back and forth on like, does the Maillard reaction occur at like a significant rate in the boil and in wort just in general?
Yeah. Well, my understanding is that, correct me if I'm wrong, Matt, manganese and iron are both heavy metals, right?
Yeah, they're metals, yeah.
So it makes me wonder if maybe so people have this thing about, well, if you throw, for example, a copper immersion chiller or something like that into your wort, then it actually has some sort of it can have an impact on the ultimate character of that beer compared to something that, say, gets pushed through a stainless plate chiller or something like that. It just makes me wonder about the impact that these metals might actually have on desirable or undesirable characteristics. And it sounds like what Andy is saying here is that perhaps certain levels of manganese or iron, and I know manganese is getting a lot of talk in terms of oxidation of New England IPA as well. But if these Maillard reactions might not be in some way influenced by levels of these metals in the wort. I think it was interesting.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I would love to hear more about it, or love to see resources or a review of that impact.
Absolutely. Well, if you have any show feedback like Andy's, you can send it to feedback@brülosophy.com or leave us a voice message by calling 951-444-0320. Hey, Matt, have you had the opportunity to try one of these weird milkshake IPAs yet?
I have never tried a milkshake IPA, and I've got to be honest, I don't have a huge desire to.
Well, don't hate, dude. They are a very interesting style. Basically, now I think this is what it is. I've seen many recipes, and I have had the opportunity to try a few. Basically, they're like a New England IPA that has lactose, so milk sugar. It's a non-fermentable sugar, and I think people usually also dose them with either vanilla and or fruit. Well, homebrewer Jeff Banco sent me one that he calls $5 Shake.
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
Del amor, como lo hace con esos amantes.
Ooh. This one's clear.
No, it's not clear, homie. It's got
Mine
that urine color.
Not the urine. Smells like urine.
Ooh. What do you think? Piney?
Piney?
Yeah.
Piney fruity.
Well, excuse me, learned man.
It's probably neither.
We don't even need me anymore. You take care of it.
Damn, that's not bad either.
I feel like the longer we do this, the more we start to like everything. We're becoming useless.
I'm not liking the aftertaste.
Hashtag fake beer review.
Yeah, the first sip was good.
No, I like it. I like it a lot.
It's an IPA.
Dude,
it's not?
No, I don't think that it is. Here's the thing. We don't say IPA anymore. We've learned this the hard way. We just say pale ale. That way, if it's an American pale ale or an India
We're like
pale ale.
half right.
We're already right. We're just like, yeah, that's what I meant. APA, yeah. Or it's like a New England pale ale or NEPA or whatever
It's
they call it.
a PA.
Oh, it's a NEPA. We're going to fail this test.
Again.
Whatever it is, I like it a lot.
It's got the aftertaste of the IPA, which I don't like that much.
So if it's not an IPA and it has an aftertaste of IPA, it has an identity crisis. It's going to fit right in this modern society.
I've had worse.
I give it 7 Jersey Tims. That's a 7 Jersey Tim.
Really?
That's a 7 Jersey Tim beer.
Oh, probably 5 for me.
Okay, so an average of 6 Jersey
6,
Tims.
yeah.
Hey, 6 Jersey Tims. That's not too shabby.
Not,
I mean,
not bad.
Not bad
at all. I've got to admit, I rescind my my earlier comment. I would like to try this beer. That sounds great.
because of Jersey and Tim. That's great.
Because
man.
of Jersey and Tim. That's exactly right.
So I've actually had the opportunity to try a couple of these beers. I also tried the $5 Shake, and I'll be honest, it is not my thing. I like my beer to taste like beer, not vanilla or fruit or milkshakes or whatever. And I also tend to prefer my IPAs be quite dry. So the lactose doesn't really do it for me. But that being said, I understand that's a personal opinion of mine. And as far as milkshake IPA goes, given what the aim is, I'd have to say that Jeff's $5 Shake really did hit the mark. It had a really nice hop aroma, very Citra forward. I got just a touch of that with Citra and hops like Mosaic. I tend to get a tiny touch of kerosene every once in a while. I think it's kind of pleasant personally. And I also got in the flavor this really interesting peaches and cream flavor that reminded me of like those Quaker oatmeal packets that I used to eat when I was a kid, the peaches and cream one. Not bad, you know, for what the beer was designed to be. I'd have to say that I think he probably hit the mark. The guys liked it. You know, I'm not going to be making one anytime soon, but for the style, I think Jeff nailed it. I really appreciate you sending it in, dude. If you want to have your beer or any other fermented beverage that you make or feel like sending it to us to be reviewed by Jersey and Tim on the show, email me, Marshall@Brülosophy.com, and we will get you all set up. We'll be back in a minute. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brülosophy sent you. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com.
Hi, I'm Stephen Leach, creator of Brülosophy Brewing Systems, here to tell you about our latest Unibrow brewing system. Modeled after the brew in a bag method, the Unibrow uses the same kettle for both mashing and boiling, replacing the fabric bag with a stainless basket that can hold up to 20 pounds of grain. A heating element is run by an electric controller that allows for the maintenance of specific mash temperatures and makes mashing easier than ever. Each Unibrow is shipped with a counterflow chiller and the parts required to brew a batch of beer. We're really proud of the Unibrow, and we know you'll love it as much as we do. Go check it out at brewsupply.com and sign up for our email list to receive special deals in your inbox.
Brewing beer is a fairly convoluted process that can require, at least a couple of hours, maybe upwards of 6 hours, which, this isn't necessarily the case for hard cider. In fact, my cider brew days take maybe 12 minutes, give or take, basically however long it takes to sanitize a fermenter, fill it with juice, and pitch the yeast. Of course, there are various ways to go about making hard cider.
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's on the contrast to the short brew day, if you do what I do and you end up pulling and pressing your own apples, then that's a whole other day in and of itself that you just go into the juice production in terms of like the actual production of hard cider. And so like it's one of those areas where we can talk about like the wide range of variability in not just the process, but in the cider itself.
So traditionally, it seems like, I mean, obviously, I think like bottled, pasteurized, clear, clean juice is a relatively new development. Traditional ciders, which have a very rich and long history, were essentially, my understanding is, you'd pull these apples off the tree, you'd juice them up, and then you just let them sit and ferment. What are some of your thoughts on the differences between cider and juice?
It's pretty interesting you bring that up, because it's really a North American, specifically like United States American thing, to call hard cider cider. Or to call it hard cider, effectively, to have the hard prefix there. Usually when, in the rest of the world, when we refer to what we call hard cider, cider is just the appropriate word. Cider is the word for juice, and juice would just be, or cider, what we call cider in the United States, we are typically referring to like unfiltered or unprocessed apple juice,
right.
Usually, around harvest time. But when everyone else says cider, they mean hard cider, and juice is just, regardless of whether it's fresh or unfiltered or very processed or anything like that, it's just juice.
Oh, that's interesting. So in the rest of the world, then cider basically refers to an alcoholic juice, basically.
Yes.
Whereas juice could be okay. That's interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that.
Totally. And I like the distinction actually, just because only like when I'm talking about the production of cider, just because it's easier to refer to juice or cider based on like kind of what state the solution is in, and then kind of like what stage in the process you're at. It's easy to talk about juice versus cider and have people, and know the meaning without necessarily the context clues of where, is this fermented or is it not fermented? But that's really where that distinction comes from. And it's somewhat arbitrary. Well, it really doesn't matter.
So hard cider is redundant. That's like saying alcoholic beer, like a duh.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. Hard cider is redundant from an outside of America context, for sure.
We don't care, do we?
No, I don't give a shit. It doesn't matter at all to me what it's called. Anyways, but yeah, so that's where it is. And kind of like you mentioned, and we just touched on, the actual juice itself, what you have going into hard cider, in the same way that wort is, it radically changes the final character of the beer in terms of what you're putting into it, what you're ultimately fermenting. Juice is the same way, like we have a huge range of dessert apples to like culinary apples and just cider apples, which aren't as popular here in the States, but like it's a very rich tradition. Like there's a huge range of it, and those apples themselves have a huge range of character.
Yeah, I was doing some reading a couple years ago on different types of apples that are used in cider making. And I was pretty, I was kind of surprised to see that what you're referring to is dessert apples, or like apples that we eat at work for lunch type of thing, right? Yep. Fuji and Red Delicious and all of that, that those sweet, tasty, crisp apples that we all enjoy eating aren't actually I'm going to use the word recommended for use as cider apples, which my understanding is that traditionally cider apples tend to be smaller and really bitter, I guess. A crab apple or something like that.
Yep. So crab apples are in a class of their own in that regard, and they, there's a lot of great ciders out there that blend in crab apple juice. But you're exactly right. Like typically when we think of like dessert apples or table apples, like those are the same thing, dessert and table apples. We're thinking of varieties like Gala or Red Delicious, like the big red ones.
Yep. Fuji apples,
yes.
Pink Ladies, all the ones you'll find at the grocery store, I imagine.
Exactly. And those are going to have like a low tannin content. They're not going to be as astringent. They're not going to be as bitter. Their sweetness is going to be, it can be anywhere from like moderate to pronounced. Something like a green apple might, or, they might be a little more sharp in terms of the acidity, but, they're definitely not the same as cider apples, which you're looking at varieties there, like, Liberty. Liberty's a really common one. Winesap is a good one. Gold Rush is another. But I mean, the point is that those cider apples, also vary widely in their character, similar to how like our malts themselves are, definitely different in beer production. But you have a range of effectively the tannin character, a range of the acid levels, and a range of the sweetness.
Yeah. And in my reading, it's almost like the folks who are really serious about, I'm going to refer to it as more traditional cider making. Yep. They almost fall more in line with like winemakers than they do, brewers of beer. Not that's not a derogatory thing, but they're looking for things like tannin character and fermentability and almost more. They're looking to produce ciders that have almost more of a wine-like character to it.
Totally.
Yeah, and so of course, in order to be able to ferment those types of juices, if you will, you got to kind of be near places that grow those types of apples and have access to that juice, preferably fresh pressed, which a lot of us don't have. And so some of us resort to, an easier route.
Yeah, definitely. That's probably, I think for home cider makers, that's probably the most common, right? Like if you listen to professional cideries that have their own orchard, like you'll hear them talk extensively about like, the 3 or 4 day window within the harvesting period that the apple ripeness is appropriate for whatever they want to make for controlling the sweetness and blah, 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 and all those things. And that's fascinating. Yeah. It's great. But obviously, that's just not viable for a lot of us, especially in terms of like, even if you do have an orchard nearby and you're paying a lot per pound of apples, it's just almost unfeasible. And so as we go through that, people resort to, I say resort like it's a bad thing, but they end up utilizing, juices from like Costco or from Walmart or, just a fresh, or just maybe not even fresh, but a juice that's like been very heavily filtered. It's been processed somewhat. It probably has like ascorbic acid in it for pasteurization and just for, for general control and longevity.
There's that saying when it comes to brewing water, that if it tastes good, then it's good for brewing with. I like the way regular juice from Costco or my local, grocery store, I like the way it tastes. And so, if I'm using that kind of theory, then hey, it should taste good if I ferment it for a bit, right?
Absolutely. I mean, and if you under the right conditions, I think you can produce excellent ciders with that kind of juice. I think there's nothing wrong with that at all, and there's a lot you can do to manipulate cider, fresh pressed or from juice, at different stages in the process to kind of bring out different characters. So yeah. I actually just at the Chaos Brewbarbecue, I brought 2 hard ciders, a habanero cider and then just a semi-sweet cider, both from Walmart Juice, and I kicked both of those kegs and people loved it. So dude, there's nothing wrong with those.
So the way obviously, if you're not using these kind of traditional apples, and the juice that comes from them, at least, you're probably gonna obviously you're not gonna get certain characteristics that those apples are known to impart. You might have different tannin character. You might have different. I mean, obviously, you're probably gonna have different flavors, but that doesn't mean it's going to be bad. And I think you and I both, like you just said, with your Walmart ciders that you made, one of my favorite juices to buy, especially when it goes on sale, it's like $2.50 for a gallon of this stuff. So I can throw together, a batch of 5-gallon batch of cider for, 15-20 bucks plus the cost of yeast and whatever fruit I put in there. So, it really don't, just because it's not traditional doesn't mean it's not going to be good. Speaking about traditional, you've got these different types of apples that produce these very interesting types of juices that people are fermenting more traditionally. There's also a kind of a traditional way to ferment hard cider, and I think probably the most traditional is natural fermentation, which you mentioned you did with the cider that you ended up winning gold with.
I did, yeah. So I would agree. Like, natural fermentation probably has one of the longest histories in terms of, in terms of alcohol production in general, but definitely in terms of cider production, just because, yeast is really present in the apple and just on the apple skins. So if you were to press juice without any sort of pasteurization or any sort of treatment, you'll get fermentation for sure. And the problem is it's a real crapshoot as to what you're getting. It's a huge gamble because it's exposed. So as much washing as you can do and as much careful tactics you can employ, you can really end up with a wide range of flavors that are good or bad that can come out of that process.
Right.
So it's really tough to do. And I like I mentioned before, like, I lucked out in terms of like how it ended up being really clean, a little funky for sure. And it, that's kind of to be expected. And but it didn't have like a lot of acetic acid production, which can come from, oxygen exposure and wild yeast, just in general. So it ended up pretty tart, but I loved it. Anyways, but like, before back sweetening, because it was wild, like that cider was incredibly dry, but it had a really wonderful apple aroma that I really liked. That was really deceptive. So
I'm so bummed I didn't get to taste it, man.
Jake and Malcolm did actually.
Oh, great! I'm glad you invited me to that party.
I did bring some.
Jeez.
Yeah. So there you go. But it was the real risk with natural fermentation is you're taking a gamble on what you're getting. And
right.
I can't necessarily recommend that to a ton of people in terms of like if it's your first time pressing, just because, cider is, it's expensive to produce if you're doing it with fresh juice and you're not doing like a bulk buy or you don't have apple orchards nearby. So if you do want to do that, and if you do want to do natural fermentation, limit the oxygen exposure pre and post fermentation. Just rack directly into your fermentation vessel if you can. Limit oxygen exposure and really, do nutrients, like really try to provide, and pectic enzymes, but really try to provide the best environment for the good yeast that you can.
So my understanding is that for the reason you want to limit oxygen exposure isn't necessarily for the risk of oxidation. That's not necessarily an issue with cider, but it's to reduce the likelihood of acetobacter taking over and basically turning your cider into apple vinegar.
Yeah, apple cider vinegar. That's exactly it. And it's, like some of that's just going to occur naturally. So natural fermentation is awesome, and it can produce like really wonderful characters. There's some breweries that are doing it, like, and they compare their ciders to lambics, like just in the range of character that they're producing and the variability in that final product, like heavy barnyard characters to some slight funkiness to whatever. But it's definitely risky. It's not nearly as risky as using like a wine yeast or a beer yeast. So
I was going to say that for those who prefer more predictability and maybe taking less risks with the juice that they got, I think the more common, at least up until a few years ago, as far as I know, that people were commonly using wine yeast or cider yeast, which I believe are primarily basically wine yeasts.
Yes, yeah. So I mean, commercially speaking, wine yeast is still the most prevalent in terms of what's being used for commercial production of cider. And you'll find that range just from, usually champagne yeasts to different kinds, but you'll end up with a really dry cider.
Right.
So it's typically when we talk about cider yeast, they're usually marked as a wine yeast that is emphasizing like fruit. Like it emphasizes fruit characteristics in the final product.
And also highly attenuative is my understanding.
Yes. Yeah, totally. Like Saf Cider from Fermentis is a good one. White Labs has a cider blend that they use for both ciders and mead, which tells you a little bit about like the alcohol tolerance of those strains because they're old wine yeasts. But anyways, like a wine yeast is super commonly utilized, and it's going to bring you like right around that final terminal gravity of like 0.998. Which is, pretty dry.
Pretty dry. That's super dry, man.
It's pretty dry.
That's like Asahi super dry.
It's don't knock a dry cider until you try it. It can be done.
Yeah, I enjoy them. Yeah.
But at that gravity, like I said, like it's a dry cider. It might be a bit thin, depending on whether or not you've accounted for that with other factors, like a really high tannin apple.
Right.
So, it's really based around that, but wine yeast is definitely the most prevalent, and you have a lot of opportunities there for experimenting with different wine yeasts. Like, I think it's Lallemand 71B, that it actually metabolizes a little bit of malic acid, which is the acid we find in apples. So when you have like a really sharp juice, or maybe like a really sharp, you can use 71B and it might curb that sharpness a little bit. But if you use 71B and you have like already a mild or low tartness or a low malic, like a little acid character, it might like bring it out of balance. So there's a lot of room to experiment within those wine yeasts, but those are definitely the most commonly used.
It makes sense to me. 71B has got to be the most commonly cited yeast that I see being used to ferment mead, and I see it a lot with wine as well.
Totally.
So it is that's a popular strain. It makes sense to me that if that has the ability to metabolize malic acid and potentially even other acids, I don't know, that you would want to use these apples that perhaps have maybe a bit more tannic character and higher acid content, which a rule of thumb that I read when I was doing this research a while back was that the smaller the apple, the more acid it's going to have, right? The bigger the apple gets, the more sweet it's going to be. And that's just kind of this heuristic that people use. But these small little crab apples that when you get that juice out, they're really, apparently it's just so tannic and so tart and bitter that you can't eat these apples, or at least do it and enjoy it.
It's definitely not going to be what you expect.
Exactly.
Like, if you're used to table apples.
And when you ferment it with something like this, then perhaps that's the reason it comes out being nice and rounded and pleasantly drinkable.
71B, super commonly used. Obviously EC 1118. I don't really have a shorthand for that one, but then obviously like the Saf cider strain is super widely used. I think the guy actually who this year who made an ice cider and won cider maker of the year, I think he was using Saf cider, which is a champagne strain.
Yeah, interesting. Well, if you don't want to use wine yeast and you don't want to naturally ferment, you can always resort to using the same yeast we use to ferment our beer, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. So think like we just said, right? Like that 71B, or wine yeast and cider yeast, like it ends up really dry. A specific strain might leave behind a little more apple characteristic or fruit characteristic than other strains, or it might throw off maybe a little more. But like those strains are highly effective. Like they're meant to deal with higher gravity typically, and they produce, they're meant for fruit. Like they do that. That's their whole goal. But beer yeast, it hasn't been bred for those characteristics. Like it's not been bred to do that. And so if you want to do quick turnaround, or just like long-term turnaround, like I think, the last one of the last ciders I made, it was aged for like 8 months and it's fantastic, used 3470. It used the Weihenstephan lager strain. It threw off sulfur for like 5 months.
Yep. That strain is known for that, by the way. And I've used it as well, and it's a sulfur bomb. Yeah.
but ultimately, I loved that cider. It was fantastic. So you can use ale and lager yeasts in a really wide range. Like the one I see the most commonly used, and I just use this for those Chaos Brewbacube ones, is Nottingham.
Yep.
From, it's an English ale yeast.
Highly attenuative English ale yeast from Danstar. In fact, the very first cider I ever made, we'll talk about this in the next segment, but the very first cider I ever made was inspired by a recipe that I found online that relied on Nottingham because of the fact that that is so attenuative.
Yeah, and it is widely cited as a effective cider yeast or as an effective ale yeast for ciders.
Yeah.
Others I've seen are so I mentioned I do 3470. I've used S23 from Fermentis. I've used Chico with okay results. I actually prefer both Nottingham and 3470 to Chico. But I know you've used quite a bit of Belle Saison, and I've never done that before.
Yep, and I'll talk more about that later on when I talk about all of my experiences with brewing ciders. But I will tell you that Belle Saison is my favorite, and there are reasons that I think it's my favorite. I just think it's cool though that you can use beer yeast to ferment cider and it actually works.
Absolutely.
So another thing I want to hit on is when that cider is done fermenting, making sure that the yeast basically finish up so that we can make any other, secondary additions or anything like that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, so like I mentioned before, cider tends to finish somewhere in the ballpark of 0.998 when it's super dry, when it's totally fermented out. And you haven't added anything else to it, right? Like just straight juice. So there are, we typically want to stabilize for a couple reasons. The first related to that 0.998 number is that's super dry, like you mentioned. And so stabilizing cider allows us to back sweeten pretty effectively. It lets us, add either juice or a juice concentrate or other kinds of concentrates or other kinds of fruits in order to sweeten the final product and bring it back up. And that's actually how I produce all of my ciders. I've talked about this quite a bit recently, but I do a yearly cider press with apples in season and ferment it dry as a bone, like get it all the way down as I can, and then as needed or per like smaller batch back sweeten with either a concentrate or a juice or something else to whatever final gravity I end up doing. So there's that post-fermentation change of sweetness.
Yeah. Well, and some people seem to take pride in how dry they like their cider or whatever. Who cares? I mean, the thing is, I've measured. I did this a while back when I was making a cider 2-3 years ago. But when it was done fermenting just the juice, it went down from 1050 down to 0.998. Sounds like you get all the time. It was very, very dry. And then when I added, my back sweetener, my concentrate, it was only at 1006. It's not like that's super sweet or anything. You drink a beer that's at 1006 and that's a dry ass beer. So do what you like, do what you think tastes good. That's my thing. Don't let the prideful folks out there who think dry cider's the best get to you.
Totally. The habanero cider I am drinking right now has 3 containers of concentrate in 5 gallons, which is a lot. And I think this ended up at like 1008 or 1011. And it's fantastic. Like I love it. So awesome. Yeah, I'm with you 100%. Like there's no reason to like one more than the other.
So what are the ways we can go about stabilizing cider? I know that I tend to use chemical stabilizers, which are, potassium metabisulfite, potassium sorbate. But I know there are various ways to do this as well.
Totally. I mean, and so the one you cited is definitely the most common, and especially the most common used by professionals in both wine and cider production. And that stabilization, like especially for the use of like K-meta, which is potassium metabisulfite, it's an antioxidant. That's great. It helps for packaging. It's an antimicrobial, so it'll stop spoilage, and obviously the reduction in oxygen will also help stop spoilage. But then, like of course, K-meta will effectively kill existing cells. And I usually see that paired with potassium sorbate, which is essentially to stop the yeast from reproducing.
Right.
So using those 2 chemicals and then waiting about 24 hours and then you can back sweeten away. You're all set. The yeast is gone.
So vasectomy and euthanasia, basically, is what we're aiming for.
That's effectively what we're arguing for. Yeah.
And then correct me if I'm wrong. People use Campden tablets to bring out the chloramine and the chlorine or whatever in their water,
which is K-meta, the potassium metabisulfite.
Okay, so
Campden
or sodium metabisulfite, which is SMB,
yes,
can be used for the same purpose, right?
Yes, totally.
Okay, cool.
Interchangeably. And I'll admit, like those. the way you put that, it seems less violent than the other way that people tend to pasteurize, which is with heat, where we end up like, this is actually what I did for the cider that won this year. Essentially, you will carbonate, you'll back sweeten, you'll package, and then place sealed bottles in about like 180 degree Fahrenheit water for like 10 minutes or so. Let them cool and then store them. But that time and that temperature will get that pasteurization done. It'll kill whatever else is in there and do that. So there's positives and negatives to each. With sulfites, like some people are allergic to sulfites, and fermentation produces some sulfites through the reduction of sulfates. So you may end up like way beyond the taste threshold in terms of like the actual inclusion of sulfites. But people argue that heat will also warp the more delicate characteristics of it. So it's a little bit of each. Both are effective, and both definitely have their role in the back sweetening and stabilization of cider.
So and just for heat pasteurization, we're talking 180 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 82 degrees Celsius, right?
Yeah.
And you want to hold that cider there at 10 minutes. I know people are going to be like, how do you do that? If it's already in a fermenter. One way is to bottle pasteurize. So you bottle the stuff up if you're going to serve them in bottles anyways, and place them in a heat bath. How would you do it for a full batch?
For a full batch, I think you'd be pretty hard pressed to actually do heat pasteurization for a full batch outside of doing bottles. I've never actually done it. I have always, if I'm going to end up heat pasteurizing, I will carbonate in the keg. I'll end up using a bottle filler to purge CO2 from those bottles, and then fill or back sweeten in the bottle itself. Just do some milliliter blending in terms of like, grab some of your cider, grab whatever you're back sweetening with, do the math, just back sweeten per bottle, and then do it bottle by bottle, because raising that keg to 180 degrees, I don't know. If you have ideas, I'm open to it.
Well, no, that's sort of what I was thinking. I guess if right after you keg, if you take that entire keg and maybe put it in, 212 degree water, so it's boiling, but you hit the burner so you're not melting your rubber on your keg, and then throw that entire keg in there, and then maybe use like an electric element to keep it exactly at 180 for, let's say, an hour, so that entire volume of cider gets warm enough to pasteurize. I could see that working. I just think it's going to take a lot longer than if you do it in smaller vessels like a bottle. But
totally, at that point, man, like if you can submerge your keg in 180 degree water, you really don't even need to worry about like maintaining that 180 degrees Fahrenheit. Like if you just turn that burner or that electric off and just let it sit. I mean, usually when you talk about heat pasteurization, people recommend like 170 degrees Fahrenheit as like a minimum. Let it drop a couple of degrees over the course of that half hour or that hour, however long you want to keep it in there. It'll get the job done. It's going to be fine.
Well, so this the reason people pasteurize, besides wanting to just have a nice, predictable, clean cider, is so that they can make post-fermentation additions of things that have sugar in it without that sugar. And this is one reason, without that sugar being fermented. Now, I personally, and we'll talk about this in a bit, I personally like to have that sugar fermented before I pasteurize. But for those who maybe want to add a bunch of strawberries and get the sweetness from the strawberries to boost up that sugar, pasteurization is one good way to do that. Real quick, let's finish this segment on talking about post-fermentation additions.
Yeah, totally. I mean, so you mentioned some great ones, right? That if you have a concentrate or you have additional sugar or fruit, adding that as a post-fermentation addition can really provide a nice supplement to what you're doing. Like I mentioned, I'm drinking a habanero cider during this episode, and the heat from the habaneros and the vegetal quality really balances well with sweetness, and that's a great addition. So just fruits and vegetables and sugars, just in general. When we talk about cider, though, like the big part of the game comes from blending, in regards to the tannic quality and the acidity,
right?
So when we talk about acidity in apples, we're talking about a titratable acidity, which is an approximation of the total acidity. And Milk the Funk, which we've talked about before, and then Whittingham Hill Cider. If you haven't gone to that site, it's cider.org.uk, I believe. Amazing resource, just wealth of information.
Awesome.
So go show them love. But anyways, like acidity can really help bring out those crisp characteristics, that appropriate tartness. We've talked about the malic acid, which is apples, citric acid, which is citrus fruits, tartaric acid, which is grapes, we've talked about. So you can use acid blends or those individual acids to really do some of that milliliter level blending, like just really small amounts to get an idea of where you want to put the final batch. But that and tannins, which you can also buy, you can just buy dry tannins for wine. Make sure you dissolve them before use. But effectively, like different ciders, like, traditionally, like German ciders will have a really low tannin level. Other ciders, like French, are going to have they're defined by, partly at least, by their really high tannic character.
Another acid that I've used is lactic acid. And I pretty much anything that brings that pH down a little bit so that you get a really bright, crisp, fruity, appley cider character, I think it will work. Now, ostensibly, all of these different acids are gonna produce a different characteristic.
Totally.
But then also same thing with the tannins. I know people who every cider they make, whether it's with fresh pressed juice or treetop apple juice, they are back tannining their cider because they like the character that adds. Obviously, the other big benefit to pasteurizing is that you're able to back sweeten, so you can use and whether you're using fruit or like I think most of us do, we use cheap apple juice concentrate. By pasteurizing, what you're doing is you're not allowing that yeast to go and re-ferment the juice or the concentrate that you're adding to contribute sweetness to the cider. So pasteurization is a good thing if that's what you want. If you like dry cider, you don't need to do it. And you've got all of these options. Well, we haven't really done many cider-based experiments, but we recently published one that I thought was really interesting, and Matt, you performed. We'll be discussing those results as well as our personal experiences making hard cider when we're back from this break. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the super fast counterflow chiller, the Accelerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to accelerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. Shopping for brewing supplies online can be a real hassle, which is why we recommend Love to Brew. They've got great prices, super fast shipping, and they carry exclusive products like East Coast Yeast, the Brewers Essentials brand, and their award-winning beer recipe kits. They're also the only place you can pick up your very own Brülosophy recipe kit. The numbers don't lie. Love to Brew has hundreds of 5-star reviews and thousands of brewers are choosing them for their supplies and ingredients each year. Experience the difference at lovetobrew.com. That's brew.com. When dumping wort-soaked grain in leftover low-gravity wort while cleaning up after a brew day, do you ever wonder what your true efficiency would be if that wort made its way to the kettle instead? Using the brew bag, a fabric filter for all mash tuns and brewing methods, allows you to capture every last drop of wort. Not only does this increase kettle efficiency, it lowers your grain bill, which saves you money. Throwing wort in the trash is like dumping a 12-pack down the drain and just doesn't make sense. Use the brew bag and leave no wort behind. I've been using these filters for a long time and recommend them to everyone. I never have to worry about a stuck sparge and cleanup is fast and easy. Go grab yourself a brew bag fabric filter at brewinabag.com and be sure to use code TBP17 at checkout to get a discount on your order.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high-quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to grainfather.com. That's grainfather.com and get started today.
While some cider makers prefer a living product, meaning the yeast and whatever bacteria was on the apple skins, if naturally fermented, remain alive and in the finished product, those looking for more consistency may opt to pasteurize their cider before fermenting it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, when you're, like we mentioned before, when you're pressing that juice, you get a ton of bacteria and yeast just on the apple skins and within the apple itself. So most of the time, you'll pasteurize that cider in some way. And that's usually done either through the use of chemicals, like we talked about in the back sweetening process, or the use of heat, which we also talked about during like stabilization. And so that actually was this first experiment that I did for the group. During the actual pressing of apples for what ended up becoming the award-winning cider, I pressed 2 additional batches, so about 4.5 gallons each of juice, and ultimately ended up pasteurizing them in 2 different ways. One of them was done with a combination of potassium sorbate and potassium metabisulfite, and the other was held at 170 degrees Fahrenheit for about 15 minutes in order to kill anything off.
So are there, is out there in the cider making world, do people talk about either of these methods producing a difference in cider character? I know you had mentioned earlier about how some people think that heat pasteurization maybe changes the character of the cider before it's fermented.
Yes, totally. I mean, and it's the exact same argument in regards to the actual pasteurization of juice itself, that heat is going to adversely affect some of those more delicate compounds within the juice, and it's going to drive them off, right? You're gonna like we kind of talked about in the feedback, actually, like temperature really drives a lot of chemical reactions, and it speeds them up, especially the oxidation reactions, redox reactions, and so by heating it, you are in theory potentially damaging that juice. And that was exactly why I wanted to ferment it out, is because I don't love adding, maybe wrongfully, I don't love adding chemicals to a unfermented product, especially one that like is going to rely on yeast to ultimately ferment it. So that was what we did for this experiment, and it was tons of fun to serve to people, because usually they expect beer.
Well, because usually that's what we're known for, is the beer part of it.
I know.
But the other thing that I've heard about heat that just came to my mind as you were talking about it is the volatilization of delicate aromatic compounds.
Yep, exactly.
and I say that haughty because I've heard that mostly when it comes to making mead, which I know nothing about. I've made one batch of mead; it tasted like shit. So, but I don't like mead in general, anyways. But maybe we'll do a mead show in the future as well.
Mead is the exact same way. You'll hear people you don't want to necessarily heat the honey unless you're making something like a bochet, which is a caramelized, like a burnt honey mead. But otherwise, yeah, like if you're using like a buckwheat honey and you heat it, the theory is that you're going to drive off those volatile aromatics.
Yeah. Well, delicate. You have to use the word delicate. That's the word.
You're right. You're right.
So tell us about your delicate experiment that you did with. Should we say you were excited to do this experiment?
I was excited. Oh man.
So
dumb.
Now I know.
There's a huge missed opportunity to name the cider.
It's a completely
I'm going to use that in the
ignored
future.
opportunity.
Anyways, I'm stealing it. Anyways, so I was excited about this for sure. Especially because, like I mentioned, I don't love adding chemicals, and it's easier for me to heat it, just because I don't have to remember as much stuff when I bring it for brew day. So effectively, what happens is, I ended up at the little family mini orchard that my in-laws have and are generous enough to let me, grab a bunch of their apples. We do a big pressing. I pressed a ton of juice, split it 4.5 gallons in each batch. One chemically pasteurized, one heat pasteurized, and then both had soft lager S189, which is a Swiss lager yeast that Fermentis produces as a dry yeast. I rehydrated both of those in the cider with some GoFerm for nutrients. I added nutrient additions to both of these batches. I always add nutrient additions to cider. I don't know about you, but I did a nutrient addition, especially because it's an ale or a lager yeast, a beer yeast. Ultimately, I ended up fermenting those out. They both got really dry, which was excellent. Bottled both up and then served them to participants. So it was really straightforward. They were petulant as far as carbonation goes, so not quite sparkling, but not quite still, which is my sweet spot. It's right where I like it.
So ultimately, when the ciders were finished, you served the experiment to 21 different participants, which would require 12 of them to be able to identify the odd cider out in order for us to say that there was a significant difference. But ultimately, in the end, only 8 people were able to identify the different cider, which really could just amount to guessing. That's almost 1/3, which is what we expect from a triangle test. So, from that, there's a lot to this, I think, that's really interesting. It shows that you can use chemical pasteurization prior to pitching the yeast without creating a noticeably different flavor or aroma profile as compared at least to heat pasteurization. Not super surprising on the surface, but when I think about it, how many times have you read not to use apple juice that has sorbates in it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think there's something, I think it depends a lot on like the concentration, and like how long that's been exposed. But it definitely opens the door to some other avenues for exploring like different just commercial juices and then different dosage rates, based on that. So I was blown away by this one.
Well, yeah, and my understanding is that when you see juice on the shelf that you might want to use to ferment to make cider, or even if it's a different type of juice, maybe not even apple juice, wine, wine with grape juice, cheap grape juice wine, whatever, Pruno is what we call it in the prison. That if it says sorbate, or if it says that it's been treated with anything like potassium metabisulfite or sorbates or anything like that, don't use it, because you won't be able to ferment it. But I've always wondered, that you're pitching so much yeast that it would kind of overpower the tiny amount of stabilizer that is in that juice, which also is known for basically precipitating out once it does its thing. Doesn't it fall out of solution anyways?
Yeah, it does flow out of solution. Does fall out of solution, and in a similar way, like like we mentioned before, like the primary purpose of the potassium addition, or the potassium sorbate addition, is to essentially stop existing yeast from reproducing.
Right.
That's not to be said that it won't inhibit yeast that's introduced into that solution, but at a high enough pitch rate. I mean, based on these experiments or this exciderment that I just did,
God.
It doesn't seem. Oh no, we're running with that as long as we can.
I don't know if we can.
It doesn't seem to have produced a noticeable difference.
It's fascinating. Yeah. I love cider. We've been getting a lot of questions over the last couple of years about cider in terms of experimentation. And I'm super stoked to do more of these. And while this may be the only controlled experiment that we've done so far, both of us have brewed, if you will, I guess made quite a few batches of hard cider.
Yeah.
And have played around with a bunch of variables. But before we get to that, I want to remind everyone about Brewers Hardware, who specialize in triclover compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique items for home and craft brewers, including high-quality stainless fittings at great prices and super fast shipping. Don't forget to check out the BCS 482 control system. It provides everything needed for total electric brewery automation. Learn more at brewershardware.com, and don't forget to mention Brülosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. That's brewershardware.com. So what I thought we would do here, Matt, is I'm going to go through my timeline of cider making. I wasn't even sure that I was a cider fan until I started making it myself. And I'm sure you're probably going to laugh at some of the stuff that I've done, but I get a lot of questions about the way I make cider. I don't think it's that unique, but we write about it so people see it, right? So the very first batch I made was, let's see, it was 8 years ago. In fact, it was 8 years ago next month, I believe, because and by next month, I'm talking about like late September. And it was inspired by this recipe that I found. I think it was on Homebrew Talk, and it was an Apfelwein recipe.
Yeah. That's a very that one's actually very common in regards to like people's first attempt at Applevine. I think it's called Edwards.
That's right.
Applevine.
And so, well, I used basically what I had in the house. So it was 5 gallons of apple juice with I forget how much brown sugar. And you blend all that together. It brings the OG up from about 1050. Now, I've used multiple varieties of store-bought apple juice for ciders, and they're almost always fall between 1048 OG and 1050 OG. So this when I added all of the sugar, it brought it up to 1085 or something like that. It was a ton of sugar. So I did that, and then I fermented it with Nottingham ale yeast. And the recommendation was just let it sit for a few months to mellow out. I let it sit for a few months, and it was so gross. Now, my brother-in-law, who happens to be on his way over to my house right now, and I was hoping he would show up for this show. He liked it, so he basically drank the full 5 gallons. We kegged it up dry. We didn't back sweeten it or anything like that, and it was kind of his jam. And he's played with cider making on his own as well. Well, after that, I kind of swore off cider making. I realized it's not my thing. And then I had the idea at one point, just for, my mind got to me and I wanted to ferment something. So I decided just to ferment straight apple juice without adding sugar and using an ale yeast. And so what I did is I made a 5 gallons of fermented treetop apple juice, basic store-bought apple juice, and I fermented it with Sathale SO4, which is like an English ale yeast. It dried out to, I believe it got down to 1.000 SG, which is really dry. But the cider ended up tasting really clean, very appley, not hot like that gross apple wine thing that I made.
Right.
But it worked out, and it's inspired me to make more. So we drank that whole keg. That one worked out fine. I realized then that, okay, I like making these hard ciders without sugar additions. So let's stick with that. So I decided to start experimenting with different yeasts. I went back to Nottingham ale yeast with just straight cider. Wasn't a huge fan. I got this weird kind of like tartness from it that I just don't really like. So for a while I stuck with just using SO4. And then I experimented with using USO5, which is the popular Chico strain. I hated that cider. It was one of the worst ones I think I've ever made.
I also am not a huge fan of Chico in my ciders. I've used Nottingham quite a bit, and I agree, it does have a little something to it. There is definitely something else going on, but I've used that again, and I've used it a couple times with success. But Chico, I didn't like it once or twice, and I just didn't go back to it.
Yeah, there's something about it it works great in beer, whatever, But when I fermented cider with it, I got this very, very faint like whisper of rubber. What I usually associate as being or think of as being sort of a like an autolysis character. Not my thing. I was really not a big fan of it. And then a friend of mine had fermented a batch of cider using 3711 Wyeast French Saison ale strain. And it came out great. And we started using that. I used that a couple of times. And the problem was that it would take forever to take off. It would just take forever to take off. You'd pitch a starter and you can make the starter using apple juice. That's what I was doing. And then I would pitch that, and it would take 3 or 4 days for this stuff to take off. And I just thought, I'm spending so much money on this packet of yeast that I'm not going to be able to use for beer because it already fermented cider. I can't harvest it later. So I figured, you know what? I'm just going to spend a little bit less and go with Belle Saison. It ended up working great. It took about the same amount of time to take off when I was just pitching it direct without nutrients. And I loved it. I loved the outcome. It always dried my ciders out. For me, Belle Saison, if you're just taking samples from the fermenter, when it's done fermenting, Belle Saison it doesn't taste like a Saison. You're not getting a whole bunch of phenolics, in my experience. You're not getting a whole bunch of esters, nothing like that. It leaves the cider with this really pleasant, almost like nutty, apple nut kind of character to it. Have you ever fermented a cider with Belle Saison?
So I've never used Belle Saison, and it's it's on my list of things to use because it is getting widely recommended in terms of just quick cider production in general. But like your experience is actually it's really telling because I'm sure you've heard before, like when you have a fermented beer and it's totally done, it's still it's not carbonated, it's not been packaged, anything like that. People usually I think end up saying like, oh well, don't judge it until it's been carbonated, or don't judge it until it's cold, or something like those lines. Cider isn't necessarily that way. Like a good cider is usually great still. And carbonation will provide a different dimension to it, especially like carbonic acid. Like as you drink it, like carbonated beverages are going to be different on your palate.
Right.
But if you have a good still cider, it's the same as a good still wine. Like you mentioned earlier, like how it's similar to wine production, that it's still going to be good. It's not going to change radically.
So yeah, you mentioned that the cider that you served for the experiment was petulant, which is kind of in between still and sparkling. And when we say sparkling, we're talking like soda, basically, right?
Yes, effectively.
So I tend to prefer almost all of my cider. I don't drink soda. But I drink a lot of sparkling water, and I love it. I love the fizz. Most of my beers, I tend to carbonate fairly, maybe a little bit higher, probably around 2.5 volumes of CO2, as opposed to following the guidelines or whatnot. My sparkling ciders, I go sparkling. I go real deep with the fizz. So. But that's just personal preference. You can do whatever you want. Yeah. But I found the same thing. I can pull samples straight from the fermenter when it's all done fermenting and really enjoy the flavor of that still cider, which is never the case with beer, which I think is interesting.
Totally. And it's a big part of it. And like, obviously like the carbonation levels are going to be wildly dependent based on like, if you're aiming for a specific style, or just, like you mentioned, like if you prefer if you prefer a really dry cider that's really highly carbonated and you're getting close to like champagne territory, that's awesome. More power to you. I also love a moderately carbonated dry cider as well. So there's a huge range of character in there for us to kind of experiment with and develop, and play with that versatility in the cider.
While we're on the topic of carbonation, I know that we're going to get people asking us about how do you carbonate when you keg? It's very easy. It's very, very easy. The difficulty with carbonation comes when you bottle condition, because if you're adding all of those stabilizers, if you're adding metabisulfite, if you're adding sorbate, you are effectively killing off the yeast that you would usually rely on to carbonate your beer. Do you have any? I honestly don't have any good recommendations for people who bottle condition. My recommendation is drink your cider still, basically.
My recommendation would be to buy a keg. That and not even and not necessarily like, you don't need to buy like a kegerator and a bunch of taps and all these things. Spend $28 or $30, get a keg and even carbonate naturally in the keg. Carbonate in a vessel that can withstand that pressure more effectively. Yeah. As opposed to like glass bottles. But then bottle from there with like some kind of a tap or a bottling gun. It depends on, if you want to spend $80, you can. If you want to spend $20, then you can do that. But if you're not interested in that route, I've definitely heard of people back sweetening and carbonating in the bottle, and that would be more closely related. The only option you have at that point is closely related to like the heat pasteurization that we talked about previously.
Right.
If you want to go that route, let's preface with be safe.
Oh Lord, I know.
But effectively, like you can back sweeten, add your concentrate, add your juice, add whatever it is that you're going to add, and add it to the bottle, rack on top of it, and then seal. And then I would also recommend filling the exact same ratio. If you can get it as close to those bottles as you possibly can in terms of ratios, and fill a seltzer bottle with everything so that it can hold that carbonation in, and use that sort of as like a yardstick for how carbonated that packaging is getting. Because if you don't stabilize it, like it'll start to carbonate, which is your only option if you do want a carbonated cider in the bottle. Do that, and then open up one of the glass bottles, be safe doing it. If it's appropriately carbonated, awesome. Heat pasteurize all of the remaining bottles.
And do it quick, because those bottles will explode.
It quick. It's going to happen so quickly. It's going to happen. I mean, just, really keep an eye on it. And we're talking like We're talking like, I mean, within start checking that seltzer bottle at like 24 hours.
Easy. Yeah.
Really start keeping an eye on that. I wouldn't recommend it. I honestly wouldn't recommend doing it just because I've had bottles explode before.
Yeah.
Like, it's definitely happened. And they're still dents in my cabinets from like where the glass embedded itself. So
Yeah.
I don't recommend it. It can be done. And heat pasteurization itself isn't dangerous. Like that.
Yeah.
That also be safe doing it. Like, always be safe doing this stuff, because if you do add carbonated bottles with sugars and stuff, and you heat it up, heat doesn't hold as well in a or carbonation doesn't hold as well in like the heated product. So just be careful, but especially if you're going that route, be extra careful.
Yeah.
Or spend $28 and just do it in a keg, and you don't have to worry.
Even if you get like a 3-gallon keg or something like that, you're good.
Seriously,
I've heard horror stories about people who try to bottle condition cider. Just be very, very careful. Do it in your garage. Cover your get a bucket that you hold your bottles in and cover it with some plywood. Or
now, if you want dry cider, if you're comfortable with like a really dry cider, like I love dry cider. If you want to do that and carbonate it, more power to you. That's exactly like beer. Use a priming sugar calculator.
Exactly.
Calculate whatever carbonation level you want and leave it dry. That's totally fine. We're talking specifically right now about like a back sweetened, sweeter product.
Exactly.
That's gonna be tougher.
Yeah. And I've had really dry ciders that have been bottle fermented or bottle conditioned. They're great. They really are good. But if you want to back sweeten, if you want to take it up from that 1.000 SG all the way up to like 1006 or maybe up to 1010, whatever it is, that's where you run into trouble. So the other option for sweetness is to add a non-fermentable like lactose, or some people will use Splenda. I've had beers that have been back sweetened with these kind of like artificial sweeteners. Well, I don't, I don't like them. They taste like artificial sweetener to me, but again, if it works for you, do it.
It's an option. Lactose especially tends to leave a distinctly milk sweetness kind of sugary character to it.
It kind of lingers on my palate. Yeah,
exactly. But that said, if you want to go that route, non-fermentable sugars, totally an option and safer.
and if you're sitting there thinking, well, how much should I add? It is honestly, this is genuine. You need to add it to taste. You add it to where you like it, and that's the best. Nobody can tell you what you like. I can't give you the advice because I've never used artificial sweetener to back sweeten a cider. But what I have used though is I tend to use apple juice concentrate, the cheap stuff that you buy at the grocery store. I started my experimentation with 1 can. My wife, I'll admit, didn't really like that. Thought it was too dry, so I upped that to 2 cans. She liked it a little bit more, but not so much. I upped it to 3 cans or canisters or whatever these things are of apple juice concentrate. And that hit the spot for her. She finally drinks my hard cider now. She loves it. She doesn't like beer, but she loves my hard cider, and I always do 3 cans now. And in my experience, that will usually bring the SG from about 1.000 up to between 1006 and 1008, depending on the brand of concentrate that I'm using. So that's how I back sweeten. I always do it, of course, after chemical pasteurization using metabisulfite and sorbate. Now, one of the more interesting experimental things that I've done with my hard cider happened after I went over to New Zealand for their homebrew fest back in March of 2017. We were hanging out at this pub one day, and it's really interesting. Over in New Zealand, everywhere you go, they have multiple hard ciders on tap. It's really nice.
Oh yeah, that's most places other than America.
Well, and you know why? And this is, I think that's a good point, right? In America, if you want to serve hard cider, you don't just have to have a brewing license. You have to have a winemaker's license. That's my understanding, and that's why you don't see very many craft breweries serving hard cider.
Craft hard cider has been it's just not been popular, especially since Prohibition. Prohibition radically changed the playing field for what kind of alcohol was available and what kind of things people were popular with. But if you talk to some craft cider makers, really it's recent years in terms of the craft beer revolution that more people are saying okay, well what about other things? What about other drinks. And craft cider's been making a huge comeback. I really hope it's as popular here someday soon as popular as it is in like England and stuff.
Unfortunately, though, I think the big limitation is going to be bureaucrat. It's
laws.
It's
for
laws.
Sure.
Yeah,
I'm
it's
100% with you on that.
Yeah, right. Well, and that's the thing. Anyways, so they don't have those laws over in New Zealand. All you craft cider lovers, and everywhere we went, my wife was just in heaven because she loves hard cider, and she'd get all the samplers. It was like me at a craft brewery, right? And so we were at this one, anyways, and she had this hard cider, and she took a sip of it, and it was like 4.5% alcohol and tart and hazy, interestingly hazy. Mm-hmm. And she looked at me and she was like, "You've got to make this at home. This is so good." And so I took a little sip and I made some notes on my phone, and I'm writing down, pH has got to be a lot lower than what I'm normally making because it was tart. And I kind of assumed it was the apples that they were using, but nonetheless, we get home, and as soon as we get home, the first 2-3 days after we got home, I threw together a batch of cider, and I was going to make it a berry cider, which this one in New Zealand was not. But when we got done, I ended up dosing that cider with 7 milliliters, 5 gallons of cider. I dosed it with 7 milliliters of 88% lactic acid. That is not very much lactic acid,
no.
But it added a noticeable sharpness to me, and so I serve it. My wife says it's great, but it doesn't have that sharp tartness that I got, when she was drinking this cider in New Zealand. So for the next batch, which I made 2-3 weeks later, I dosed it with 10 milliliters. I believe it was 10 milliliters of lactic acid. And she said, "That's it." She noticed it. I didn't tell her what I was doing, but she was like, "This awesome. Has that tartness, and it's just so crisp." And I think really adds to your kind of mentally your ability to really perceive the fruit, including the apple, as well as whatever adulterants you're adding. So berries or whatever fruit you're adding.
Yeah.
And so I'm not that now. I don't think that adding that lactic acid or adding tannin or whatever, which I've never done, is necessary. I don't want people to think that they're not going to make a good cider if they don't make these weird additions. But it certainly can. It's a fun lever to play with. You can
totally. And when we talk about tritable acid, the TA, like the approximation of total acid that we mentioned earlier in the show, like it's somewhat independent of pH, which is super interesting to me.
Right. Yeah.
And like when we talk about sour beers, we're thinking more about like the different. I think levers is probably the great word for it, right? We're thinking about the different levers where pH clearly isn't an indicator of how something tastes.
Right.
pH is not like it's not like an adequate measure of how you perceive something. So we're exploring other things, and like when we say to tritable acid, that's one of the mechanisms we're playing with here. But you're absolutely right? Like it's you can make great cider without it, and you can make. It really depends on that initial juice that you're using, and it can maybe bring out some of those other apple characters. It can make it more crisp. It can just provide that tartness, or it might throw it out of balance. Like I don't want to hard rule someone into saying like, oh, you need to be paying attention to your acidity. Like you need to be paying attention to your total acidity that's being involved. It's really down to your palate, your blending, and your personal preference at that point.
I think personal preference being the number one. And well, speaking of personal preference, we have done, or I have done, I've made ciders using dry hop additions, using berries, using mango, all sorts of stuff. You can choose whatever you want. That's the beauty of hard cider. And you can kind of choose how you want to do it. One thing we haven't talked much about, and we're not going to go into too much detail on, is using pectic enzyme to break down the pectin that the fruit contributes. And that can even be apple fruit, but also any fruit additions that you make during the cider, the fermentation process. That is said to break it down so that you don't get a pectin haze. Is that what it's called, Matt? Like a pectin haze?
Yeah, pectin haze, definitely for that. And also, obviously, like if you use it during the production of the juice itself, it helps remove just pectin from the apple juice, which is both pectin haze, and it increases yield a little bit for people who are making commercial cider. So that helps a lot. There's a couple of reasons to use it, but pectic enzyme, especially if you have like a hazy juice. Like if you have like if you go to Whole Foods and you buy like a fresh pressed apple juice, and they'll call it apple cider, and they're liars. Get apple juice, and You can use a pectic enzyme. It'll help clear that up.
Cool. So I've never used that. I don't think I've ever used it at the very least. I don't anymore. So, but real quick, before we finish this episode, I know it's gone a little bit longer than usual, and there's just so much to talk about when it comes to cider making. But I want to go over my general process. A lot of people have been asking me about this. Matt, you and I have talked about it. I know that our process is fairly similar, but I'm going to go, I've never used fresh pressed juice. You have. So we're going to start from the juices in our garage point.
Yep, let's do it. And if anyone has other questions, just reach out to one of us.
Just reach out to one of us and we'll answer them. So for those of you who are looking to make your first batch of cider, here you go. This is what I would recommend. So what I do is I go to the grocery store and I buy 5 gallons of apple juice, whatever. It only has ascorbic acid in it, and that is just out of my fear. Even though it may, based on the experiment results, it may not matter. I'll usually just buy apple juice that has had vitamin C or ascorbic acid added to it. You can get the cheapest stuff on the shelf. It's all apple juice, and from what I've heard, it comes from the same places. So don't worry about that. Grab yourself some apple juice. You can buy really nice hard cider, you can buy really nice ciders, quote unquote ciders or hazy juices that have been completely unpasteurized if you want. Whatever, get your juice, bring it back to your garage, add it to a sanitized fermenter of your choice. I like to use clear plastic carboys for this, only because it allows me to kind of observe fermentation character. It looks a little bit different than beer does when you're fermenting it, and that's sort of my gauge for when fermentation has started, when it's done, whatever. Add that juice to your fermenter anyways, and then I like to add a little dose of nutrient. This is something that Jake recommended to me, and I know it's very common when you're making mead and wine as well as cider. I had never done it until I bought some nutrient a few months ago, and it really does contribute, in my observations, to shorter, reduced lag times, so the fermentation kicks off quickly. Add your yeast. I like, my favorite is Belle Saison. It will remain my favorite until I try something else that I like more, but it's cheap, easy to use. Just sprinkle it right on top of the cider, throw airlock on, and then leave it alone. When you're using a Saison yeast, one of the benefits to that is you really don't have to worry too much, in my experience, about fermentation temperature. If your ambient temperature in your house is somewhere around 68 to 70 degrees, even with the exothermic raise in temperature that you're going to get from fermentation, you're only going to be up at around 74. And that I have intentionally fermented cider at 74, and it turns out great. So that's the beauty of Saison yeast. You can also use, and I really do like, probably my second favorite yeast that I've used is the Weihenstephaner strain. So 3470 or Imperial Global is another one. I like to ferment that at ale temperatures. There's really clean, smooth cider character that seems to produce a little bit more haze than when I use the Belle Saison strain, which is interesting to me. But so let that ferment for a week or two until signs of fermentation are waning. And then that's when I will add my fruit. Now, little side note on adding fruit. This can be a little bit tricky if you're using frozen fruit. I honestly buy all of the fruit that I add to my ciders at Costco because they come in 4 or 5 pound bags, which I think is really convenient because that's about as much as you want to add to your cider.
There's nothing wrong with that because it takes so much fruit usually. Like I just recently made a peach cider that was it's about 3 pounds of peaches per gallon.
Yeah,
and
that's a lot of
it's
peach.
fairly restrained. It's a lot of peaches, and usually I hear people recommend apricots like as an alternative because it'll help bring out some maybe peach characters. But some fruits especially like raspberries as well. It's a lot. It takes a lot of fruit.
Yeah, definitely. So what I usually do though, just for those so that I don't get a million emails, I'll take the frozen fruit. And I'll put the bag of that frozen fruit in another fresh, clean, brand new garbage bag. And then, because they will leak, those bags leak. I've got stains on my garage floor to prove it. So take that frozen fruit, put it in a garbage bag that's clean, set that in a bowl, and leave it out in your garage overnight for 24 hours or so. I've never had an issue with that fruit starting to ferment on its own when I leave it for a day. I've never left it for much longer than that. Usually what I'll do is I'll return. I use my hands to just mush it up. It's usually still pretty cold, but I mush it up as fine, as mushy as I can get it. And then using a sanitized funnel, I put that in the carboy and then I just pour the fruit right through the funnel, right directly into the primary. Re-fermentation occurs. I let that ferment for another week until there is absolutely no observable fermentation left because I want to make sure that what I refer to as kind of the initial cider is fully fermented all the way down to as low as it's going to go. It usually will finish at about 1.000 after you add the fruit. So you have to imagine, if you're at about 6% alcohol before you add the fruit, you add all of that fruit, you're bumping that ABV up even a little bit more because you're allowing it to re-ferment. Definitely. So then what I'll do is I'll add the stabilizers. And when I add that, based on a recommendation from my friend Drew Beecham, who wrote the book on brewing hard ciders, I'll add potassium metabisulfite. I'll add potassium sorbate. And you can go and read about the specific amounts you should use over at brülosophy.com. I'll add those, and I'll give the carboy a little bit of a shake just to get that stuff nice and dissolved. I'll let it sit overnight, and then I cold crash the next day. I found that when I'm adding, especially when I'm using berries, that I get a really clear cider after 24 hours, even without the use of gelatin or pectin enzyme or anything like that. So I've stopped using gelatin pretty much. I cold crash it for about 24 to 48 hours. And then when I get to kegging, I always keg my ciders. I always keg everything, basically. When I get to kegging, what I do is I pour 3 defrosted apple juice concentrates into the sanitized keg, and then I rack the cider on top of that. But when the keg is about halfway full, I'll pick it up and I'll just shake the hell out of it. And there's a reason I do that. The first time I ever back sweetened a hard cider with 3 cans of concentrate, I didn't do that. I threw it in my keezer. I come back 2 days later, and the first pour was a completely uncarbonated full glass of apple juice concentrate. So it is more dense than the cider, so it will fall all the way to the bottom, especially because that cider is so cold. It's not going to be very easily incorporated into the cider. So I give it a really good shake. Kind of disconnect it from racking the cider over, and then I reconnect it, rack the rest of the cider in there. Once it's totally full, I give it another good shake, throw it in the keezer, and I hit it with 50 PSI for 24 hours, sometimes a little bit more. I carbonate the hell out of my hard cider. I come back and I reduce it to a serving pressure of between 15 and 18 PSI. It comes out pretty fast, but it always comes out sparkling, and that's exactly how I like it. Within about 3 or 4 days, it's usually crystal clear if I'm doing berry. The mango cider that I recently did never really cleared up. And I had to wonder if maybe that was because of, pectin enzyme or whatever it was.
Could be that mango addition that possibly
Exactly. And so, and the stabilizers apparently have some sort of impact on it as well. It's going to drop that yeast out. So, but that's my general process. Matt, is there anything you do differently?
No, I think that's an excellent summary of the great way to approach this, especially if you just want to go out, grab some juice from a local store, and then, get fermenting. It's a really quick brew day. I would second Jake's recommendation of using the nutrients early in the process, just because, especially if you're using an ale yeast, ale yeast isn't really suited to a juice environment. And having especially the nitrogen from an additional nutrient addition can really help. So I think your process that you talked about is a great place to start, especially from a juice perspective. It gets a lot more complicated with the if you're paying attention to the fresh pressed apples and all the tannins and all that stuff. I think that's all great, and I mean I'm a big believer in especially the total acidity that's being measured. But to start out, get some juice, throw some stuff in, and start tweaking a little bit. Just play some experiments and go with it on your approach. And granted, you are going to make an awesome cider. I've made great cider with juice before, and I love it, and I'll continue doing it because it's more easily accessible than some
dude, I'm going to go to the store right when we're done recording this show and buy 5 gallons of cider.
I know, I'm feeling it, aren't you? I feel
I'm so thirsty.
I want to get some cider.
Yeah. So, that is all the time we've got for this show. We went way over our normal time constraints.
We
here.
did, yeah.
But I think hopefully people liked it out there. Let us know if you want more shows like this in the future about cider. We can bring some people on who do more stuff about mead as well. We're happy to do that. We don't have very many experiments, but we plan to do more, especially with cider. I'm certainly looking forward to it. If you want to read about our excursions into cider making, check out the Brew It Yourself series over at brülosophy.com. If you just search for cider, you should find it there. The Brülosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brülosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brülosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brülosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.